Hi everyone. It's really unfortunate that so many popular portrayals of Yolo Morganwg misrepresent the complexity of coming to any definitive conclusions on the authenticity of his work. I've seen a few poor YouTube videos recently that have just called him a forger, to be honest. Quite facile stuff, and this quite reductive view seems to be more or less ubiquitous. So what I thought that I'd do is to give a couple of examples that might show the grey area in something that is too often suggested as being black and white. For those who don't know, Yolo was a stonemason from Flemingston in the Vale of Glamorgan, active in the late 18th and early 19th century, and best known as an antiquarian and copyist of Welsh manuscripts. It was through his efforts that a great number of Welsh manuscripts were copied and published for the first time. The Myvyrian Archaeology was one landmark publication. A lot of other material was then posthumously published, notably in a compilation called the Yolo Manuscripts. Initially, the literature Yolo Morganwg collected was widely regarded as authentic, and much of it indeed was. But even in Yolo's own lifetime, there were whispers of some possible forgeries, which grew louder over time. G.J. Williams became the greatest authority on this issue, writing about 100 years after Yolo. This Welsh literary scholar scrutinised Yolo's sources in the greatest detail and concluded that some of the work wasn't authentic. Okay, so there he is, G.J. Williams, one of the all-time greats. This is a really long article on a Bywgraffiadur, but he's popularly known as the person who exposed Yolo as a forger. And let's be clear, he did suggest that he believed that aspects of Yolo's material was forged. But what has struck me in reading G.J. Williams' books is how cautious he was with many of his conclusions. He also had a great deal of praise for Yolo, rightly crediting him with achieving a great deal and making an enormous contribution to Welsh literary scholarship, which is often forgotten. So the books are a goldmine really for those who want to really understand Yolo, his work and the wider tradition. G.J. Williams had planned to write a series of books on this to help us with interpreting and understanding Yolo's work, but he sadly passed away after only publishing the first. He had previously published other scholarly books, notably one that focused on the poetic works that Yolo had attributed to Wales's best-known literary figure, Dafydd ap Gwilym, and another on the literary tradition of Glamorgan. All these are really well-researched and insightful publications, actually some of my favourite books. But I don't think that G.J. Williams' books are that widely read, even by those who seem to have a lot to say about Yolo. One issue is their accessibility. G.J. Williams usually wrote in Welsh. Obviously, it's natural to do so when critiquing literature that's also in the Welsh language. However, the ideas in Yolo's material have a much broader appeal than to those who normally have an interest in Welsh literature, covering topics like Druidism, early Christianity in Britain, King Arthur, the earliest Welsh bards, and much more. Now, I'm not a scholar myself, and my opinion is not really sought by anyone, but I do speak Welsh, and I have at least read G.J. Williams' books, and it seems to me that he was quite cautious to the extent that he would claim that certain ideas were entirely fabricated by Yolo. Instead, these studies often present careful conclusions that reference existing sources that seem to suggest that similar concepts were traditional in Glamorgan. That's Yolo's home county and the subject of a lot of his work. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't forge work, but actually answering this question definitively is nigh on impossible, and we can't just throw out the authenticity of certain traditions just because Yolo may have also written about them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to look at two examples of ideas that are associated with the work of Yolo and are generally dismissed as inventions of his, but which there is evidence of in the literary sources that predate Yolo. So one idea is that an early Welsh saint called Ilid can be identified with the biblical figure Joseph of Arimathea. This is not the usual suggestion as to the identity of Ilid. A good place to start is in Bartram's Welsh Classical Dictionary. Bartram was an authority on early Welsh persons, and his work is really well researched. So he says this: Saint Ilid, the Welsh form of the name of Gelita, the saint of Iconium, mother of the boy martyr Cyriacius, who is called Cyrig in Wales. The full name of Llanelid Morganwg has always been Llanelid y Chyrig. Again, in Arllechwedd, Gwynedd, Cabel Cyrig, has been called Capel Cyrig a'i fam, Julita. In the former case, the original dedication was to Ilid ferch Brachan, and in the latter case, probably to a Welsh saint Cyrig. Cyrig and Julita, or Ilid, are entered on June the 16th in most of the Welsh calendars. This is the day of Kyriacius and Julita in the Roman martyrology. Yolo Morganwg apparently invented the name Ilid as the Welsh equivalent of Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, interesting from Bartram, the Ilid connection with Joseph of Arimathea, probably just a forgery according to him, and Ilid should be connected with Julita. Bartram also mentions this Christian site near Pencoed, Glamorgan, Llan Ilid. Llan typically refers to an early Christian enclosure, and Ilid then believed to derive from the name of a religious leader from the past as connected with it. There is still a church here today from a much later period than this, but the site itself is probably an early Christian foundation, judging by the shape of the boundary walls and the presence of some very ancient looking yew trees. So let's have a closer look at the Iolo suggestion. This is the translated extract from something called the genealogy of Iestyn ap Gwrgant. As the name suggests, this includes genealogical information in the lineage of Iestyn ap Gwrgant, the historical last king of Glamorgan, who was killed by the Normans in the late 11th century. This was supposedly copied by Iolo from, according to him, one of the manuscripts of the late Mr. Thomas Truman of Panllywyd in the parish of Llansanor, Glamorganshire. Thomas Truman was a manuscript collector and antiquarian, and at least one of his manuscripts still survives at the National Library of Wales, though how closely Iolo's document reflects his reputed source I cannot say. Looking at it, it could be Iolo summarising the manuscripts, so it's more of a sort of composite work than a strict copy, but I can't be sure about that, and I expect that a lot of people will just assume that a lot of this is just made up. Okay, so the genealogy lists Iestyn's ancestors with some interesting biographical details. One ancestor is Caradog ap Arch, so there is mention of Ilid and Joseph of Arimathea, so let's have a look at that. Okay, so this is actually a long extract, so I will summarise, but the whole thing is available to read for free online. Essentially, this Caradog is equated with the historical Caractacus, and the first part of the narrative broadly reflects information that is corroborated from Roman sources. He was a Brythonic war leader fighting against the Roman conquest in the 1st century and was taken to Rome but not executed because of a rousing speech that he had made while there. So the narrative is historical up to a point, but then goes in a more legendary direction, such as the bit about Caradog returning from Rome and building a palace in the St. Donat's area. Also his daughter Eirgain marrying a Roman chieftain and senya for Ilid, who's called Joseph of Arimathea in this source, and establishing Christianity in the Llantwit area. So all this would have happened at around 50 AD, just after the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And this matches up well with the historical Joseph of Arimathea. He is someone from the Gospels that was associated with the crucifixion of Christ. He was described as a member of the Sanhedrin who assumed responsibility for the burial of Jesus after the crucifixion. There's no mention of Joseph of Arimathea after this in the Gospels, but there is a great deal of legendary material that connects him with bringing Christianity to Britain and the Holy Grail. The connection between Joseph and Glastonbury is very well known, but there are also other locations that are associated with this legend. If we take Iolo's reputed source at face value, then there is a connection with Glamorgan and a saint called Ilid. But what would strengthen the credibility of Iolo's work would be to find a reference to Joseph of Arimathea being called Ilid in a source that predates Iolo. This would seriously challenge Bartram's assertion that this was a Iolo fabrication. Now there's a really interesting reference to this in G.J. Williams' book on Iolo that I think is worth having a look at. So G.J. Williams has cited an obscure couplet of Welsh poetry that is attributed to a bard called Gittin Ceiriog, which is found in a manuscript popularly known as the Birder Mawr. The manuscript is now at the National Library of Wales. Details of it are on their webpage. The full text doesn't seem to be online, but there are details of the manuscript, and the entry says, "The manuscript, sometimes called the Birder Mawr, is in the hand of Thomas ab Ieuan of Tre'r Bryn, parish of Coedchurch, County Glamorgan, and was probably transcribed in the last quarter of the 17th century, partly from the manuscripts of an earlier Glamorgan copyist, Llywelyn Sion. It was probably presented to Edward Williams, Iolo Morganwg, by the copyist's grandson, also named Thomas ab Ifan, and there is the name of the poet in question, Gytyn Ceiriog, and no one seems to know anything more about him, to be honest. The text itself isn't available there, but it is quoted in G.J. Williams's book. It was copied into this manuscript by Thomas ab Ifan from an older source. He copied it in the last quarter of the 17th century, so that predates Iolo by about 100 years. The verse itself is considered to be in Thomas ab Ifan's hand, but we know that Iolo has definitely seen this manuscript because there are notes in Iolo's hand in the margin of the manuscript. Iolo has actually written Joseph of Arimathea next to it. So this is the couplet in question. Wrth Ilid ferthroliaeth I gladdu'r Iesu yr aeth. Again, wrth Ilid ferthroliaeth I gladdu'r Iesu yr aeth. So it says something like, by Ilid, martyrdom, to bury Jesus he went. Again, by Ilid, martyrdom, to bury Jesus he went. It's quite a terse reference, isn't it? And I can't be 100% sure what the poet meant, which is a problem inherent in using Welsh poetry as a historical source. What I will say is at face value it does seem to confirm some of Iolo's key narrative details. It does seem to connect someone called Ilid with the martyrdom and burial of Christ. As we know from the Gospels, it was Joseph of Arimathea that was responsible for this. So the most likely interpretation of this is that Joseph of Arimathea had the alias of Ilid in at least one Welsh poem that seems to be written before Yolo Morganwg. So how G.J. Williams dealt with this was to sort of suggest that Iolo saw this couplet and inspired him to elaborate on this with the wider story that we see in things like the genealogy of Iesu ab Gwrgant. But obviously, there are other ways of looking at it too. Could other manuscripts of Thomas ab Ifan shed any light on this, I wonder? You have a problem with that. There are a few of his manuscripts that have survived, but it seems possible, or even likely, that a lot were taken to Plas Hafod by the antiquarian Edward Llwyd. Iolo was there in 1799, but sadly a fire in the library in 1807 destroyed most of the manuscripts. It is very unfortunate, really. There could be evidence in there that would either vindicate Iolo or condemn him further, but they seem to be gone. This isn't a definite, but it seems likely, and you can read more about this in G.J. Williams's book on Traddodiad Llanydol Morganwg. And it's not just the manuscripts of Thomas ab Ifan that have been lost. Many from Iolo's day are not available anymore, which gives us a huge problem in corroborating his narratives. But let's try and deal with what we do have. I think that there are a couple of other possibilities that arise from Gytyn Ceiriog's Cowydd that weren't fully explored by G.J. Williams. So it could be used as evidence to show that there was a story about Joseph of Arimathea around in Glamorgan at the time of Iolo that hasn't otherwise survived. References in Welsh poetry are likely to reflect things that would have been known to the audience, traditions that may have been recorded in lost manuscripts, or maybe they were never even written down at all, but because they were so well known to the audience, we find references to them in poetry that was written down. This idea comes up a lot when looking at some of the oldest Welsh literature, mentions of Arthur or Caswallon that don't seem to have parallels in anything else, but have survived in poetry or maybe triads, but are thought to reflect a well-known narrative that was familiar to the audience. I think that we should consider this as a possibility here in relation to Ilid and Joseph of Arimathea. There's another interesting example of this too. It relates to the association between some of Wales's greatest bards with Iolo's home county of Glamorgan. This was asserted by Iolo in one of his best known publications, Cyfrinach Beirdd Ynys Prydain, which was only published 3 years after his death. Cyfrinach Beirdd Ynys Prydain is generally considered to have been composed by Iolo in the late 18th century, but which Iolo himself attributed to the old bards of Glamorgan. Mainly deals with poetic metres, specifically to oppose the Pedwar Mesur ar Hugain system of Dafydd ab Edmund that was instituted at the Carmarthen Eisteddfod of 1451. Cyfrinach Beirdd Ynys Prydain asserts a historical narrative where different measures were preserved in Glamorgan, the old orders and meters of the Britons, supposedly. Couldn't find an English translation of this one, sorry, but I'll talk you through some of the key points. This introduction was written by Iolo's son Taliesin, but draws on the material Iolo has supposedly collected himself. It sort of details how the Glamorgan order of bards in Iolo's day was more true to the old order of bards, naming people like Taliesin and Myrddin, sometimes referred to as a Kinvaird. They lived at the time of the single crown of Britain, supposedly. Iolo talks about Awen, inspiration, and this sort of religious philosophy that connected Druidism with Christianity and the bards, and how the truth was lost and only kept alive by the Glamorgan order. At around 500 AD, there was a bardic chair established at Caerleon on Usk, Dosbarth y Fordgron, the Order of the Round Table, with the motto Gwir yn erbyn y byd and Enw Duw a'i dangnef. After the death of Arthur, the chair moved around different areas of Glamorgan and referred to as the Chair of Glamorgan. And this was the sort of precursor to Cadair Tiriarch, which was definitely an authentic order of bards in the late Middle Ages and onwards, but Iolo suggested that it had its roots in the true bardism of the Britons. Okay, so can we trace any of the supposed bards of the Order of the Round Table to the Glamorgan area in work that predates Iolo? Well, a lot of work is attributed to both Taliesin and Myrddin, some of which might be derived from the historical people themselves. It's difficult to tie them down to historical areas, but Taliesin is usually connected with both Powys and Yr Hen Ogledd, the Brythonic kingdoms of the Old North of Britain. Myrddin, a bard often associated with prophecy, then is once again connected with Yr Hen Ogledd, and possibly Carmarthen, although several figures might have been conflated over time. But both figures are not usually pinned down to Glamorgan, that's southeast Wales. But G.J. Williams points to a cowydd attributed to Dafydd Benwyn, so that's a very real bard who was writing in the 16th century, and he is associated with the real order of Tiriarch. And the cowydd in question is addressed to Dafydd Benwyn's bardic teacher Richard Iorwerth, and it seems to include this idea that the famous bards of old were in Tiriarch, Glamorgan. A very similar extract is included in the introduction of Cyfrinach Beirdd Ynys Prydain. That was written by Iolo's son Taliesin, but that's definitely not a Iolo invention. It's a legitimate poem that was written by Dafydd Benwyn. I'm not aware of a translation, so I will do my best. And it goes like this: Un nad oedd awenodiaeth o diriarch awdur yr iaith. So that sort of means they were one wonderful awen of Tiriarch, the author of the language. It then goes on, yn raddol yno yr oeddynt, yr holl feirnion gwichion gynt. So how you would translate this would depend on your interpretation of the word raddol. It could mean something like noble, or it could mean something more like a formal order or graduation, or possibly both, as I'm sure that Iolo would argue. But let's just say, nobly they were there, all the wonderful bards of the past. And then it names several of them, including Myrddin and Taliesin. Myrddin a ganodd mawrdysg, mae Taliesin dewin disc. Now we don't know what the intention of the bard was when he wrote these lines. It could be completely figurative or metaphysical, but the most obvious sort of face value interpretation of this is that those bards were actually physically there in Tiriarch, Glamorgan. Now when G.J. Williams addressed this, he sort of said a similar thing as to what he said with the Gitin Ceiriog cowydd. Essentially, that Iolo must have seen this and then it sort of influenced him to elaborate on it. But I would just reiterate my point again, that maybe this does reflect a wider tradition that goes back to at least the 15th century, that sort of associated the Kinvaird, the bards of old, with Glamorgan. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there now, but the main point that I'm trying to make is that there does seem to be a precedent for many of the ideas that are associated with Yolo Morganwg in the old traditions of Glamorgan, and it's reflected in some of the literary sources that still survive, although many have been lost over the years. Okay, hope you've enjoyed this video, and what I'm going to be doing next is looking at another Dafydd Benwyn poem that's referenced by Wilson and Blackett in Artorius Rex Discovered. They say that there's an Arthurian connection here, so I'll be looking at that in great detail.